When you picture surviving a winter on the frontier, you think about fuel, firewood, coal, something burning. You imagine a stove, a chimney, a pile of split logs stacked against the cold. The more fuel you have, the safer you are. That is what everyone believed. But the thing that killed people was not the absence of heat. It was the speed at which their shelters gave heat back. A cabin with a roaring stove could lose warmth faster than the fire could replace it, through gaps, through thin walls, through every surface that touched the cold. The problem was never making heat. The problem was keeping it. This is the story of a girl who had no fuel, no stove, no cabin, and who understood that before anyone else around her did. The San Miguel Children's Home sat on a dirt road 3 miles east of Mancos, Colorado, in a building that had been a feed warehouse before someone decided orphans and grain required roughly the same accommodations. The roof leaked at 2 seams. The kitchen chimney drew poorly when wind came from the north, which in December meant almost always. 31 children slept in 3 rooms on the second floor, arranged by size rather than age, because the cots were donations and no two matched. Matea Rourke had arrived there 3 years earlier on a charity wagon out of Denver, holding a cardboard tag around her neck that read her name, her age, 13-9, and the word healthy, as if that single fact justified everything that would follow. Before Denver, she had lived in 5 Points, New York, in 2 rooms above a laundry where her mother pressed shirts until her lungs gave out. Before 5 Points, there was nothing Matea could remember clearly enough to trust. She was 16 now. She could mend harness with an awl and waxed thread. She could read a horse's breathing well enough to know when colic was settling in or when the animal was simply cold. She could count feed rations in her head faster than Headmaster Prawl could count them on paper, which was one of several reasons Prawl did not like her. The other reasons were simpler. Matea did not lower her eyes when spoken to. She asked questions that had answers Prawl preferred not to give. And she loved the orphanage's draft mare more visibly than she loved anything else in the building, which made Prawl feel correctly that the horse's loyalty to Matea was stronger than anyone's loyalty to him. Sable was a black Percheron cross, 5 years old, 1,900 pounds of calm muscle and warm breath. She hauled coal from the depot, dragged laundry water from the creek in oak barrels, and pulled the wagon when donations arrived from town. Her chest was broad enough that 2 children could sit side by side on her back during the summer, which they did until Prawl forbade it because he said the mare was equipment, not entertainment. Matea had learned Sable's language the way she learned everything, by watching. The mare flicked her left ear before she balked. She shifted her weight to her right hip before she lay down. She breathed through her nose in long, even pulls when she was content, and in short, broken snorts when something had changed in the air that a human nose could not yet detect. On the night of December 11th, 1888, Sable was snorting. The coal delivery had failed. A wagon had broken an axle on the Dolores Road, and the replacement would not arrive for 6 days. Prawl had known for 2 days and told no one. The kitchen stove burned the last quarter cord of split pine that evening, and the children ate lukewarm beans with no bread because the oven had gone cold before the dough rose. That same evening, Prawl called Matea to his office. The room smelled like ink and lamp oil, and the particular staleness of a man who believed his own authority kept the air clean. He sat behind a desk that had been donated by a mining company, and he held a receipt. "The freight contractor in Cortez will take the mare," Prawl said. $90. That covers the coal debt and 2 months of operating costs. Matea stood with her hands at her sides. Her knuckles were cracked from lye soap. Her boots had been resoled twice with leather scraps she cut herself. She said nothing, because she had learned that silence made Prawl talk more, and the more Prawl talked, the more he revealed. "You will be relocated to the Kendrick Laundry at the mining camp above Rico. He continued. Room and board provided. Your labor offsets your remaining obligation to this institution. The words sounded like they had been rehearsed in front of a mirror. Remaining obligation. Matea had no obligation. She had been placed here by a charity society that never checked back, but Prawl had a ledger, and in the ledger he had assigned costs. Her food, her cot space, her share of the coal, and those costs had accumulated into a number he could wave at anyone who asked. When? Matea asked. Sunrise. The contractor sends a man for the horse at first light. You leave on the afternoon stage. 7 hours. She had 7 hours. Matea walked back to the stable. The building was a lean-to attached to the main structure, open on the south side where canvas flap served as a door. Sable stood in the far corner, her head low, her breath making small clouds that dissolved before they reached the rafters. The temperature outside was 19 degrees and falling. Matea pressed her forehead against the mare's neck and stood there for a long time. She did not cry because crying used energy and changed nothing. She counted instead. She had one wool shawl, one army blanket with a tear along the left edge, 8 matches in a tin, a dull knife, a sack of cornmeal, 4 pounds maybe, the last of what she had been hiding in a grain bin, 2 handfuls of oats she had stolen, 1 pinch at a time over the past week, a tin cup, a halter rope. The nearest town where Prawl did not know every liveryman was 18 miles south. The rail line was farther, and she had no fare. Even if she reached a town, a 16-year-old girl with a stolen horse and no papers would be returned within a week. Prawl would make sure of it. He had friends in the freighting business. He had a ledger that made him look like a creditor, and Matea look like a debtor. She could not go to town. She could not stay. She could not ride east because the road was watched. She could not ride west because the Dolores crossing was frozen in places and running in others, and a horse that heavy could break through. South of the orphanage, beyond the last fenced pastures, the land dropped into a series of box canyons that cut toward the Mesa Verde country. Settlers called the area forbidden because stock animals had wandered in and not come back. Goat trails led to ledges that narrowed to nothing. The canyons were cold, shadowed, and had no grass worth grazing. No one went there on purpose. Matea had been there once. In October, gathering juniper roots for kindling beyond the orphanage fence, she had walked farther than she meant to. She had seen a south-facing cliff turn gold at sunset, while frost still held in the canyon bottom. She had seen dark streaks below a ledge, water seepage, the kind Rosario Valdez called a vein in the stone. She had noticed that the air near the cliff face felt different, not warm exactly, but less cold, as if the rock itself was breathing out the heat it had swallowed during the day. She had filed this away the way she filed everything, silently, precisely, without telling anyone. Now she pulled it back out. Tolliver Cade found her in the stable an hour later. Cade was 62, a retired freighter and liveryman who kept a room above the livery and mancos and came to the orphanage twice a month to check the mare's shoes because no one else would do it properly, and he could not stand watching an animal go lame through neglect. He was not kind in the way that word usually meant. He did not smile at children or bring sweets. He was kind the way a farrier is kind. He did the work that prevented suffering, and he did not require gratitude for it. He stood in the stable doorway with sleet on his hat and mud on his boots, and he watched Matea wrapping the halter rope into a coil. "Prawl told me about the sale," Cade said. Matea kept coiling. "You are thinking about the canyon," Cade said. It was not a question. Matea looked at him. Cade stepped inside and lowered his voice, though no one else was near. "Girl, that canyon keeps what it takes. Horses break legs in there. People just take longer." people who go in with nothing, Matea said. You have nothing. I have her. Cade looked at Sable. The mare looked back at him with the calm, unblinking patience of an animal that had hauled coal through ice storms and never once been thanked for it. 1,900 pounds on a goat trail, Cade said. In the dark, in December. You will kill that horse trying to save her. Prawl will kill her faster. He will sell her to a man who runs 6-horse freight teams up switchbacks in summer heat. She will last 2 years. Cade pulled off his hat and ran a hand through hair the color of old rope. He looked at the ground. He looked at the canvas flap where sleet was collecting in a fold. He looked at Matea. How far in? He asked. I do not know. What shelter? There is a cliff, south-facing. I think there are ledges. You think? I saw seep lines. I felt warm stone in October, when the canyon floor was already frozen. Cade put his hat back on. Warm stone in October is not a roof in December. A seep line is not a well. A ledge is not a cabin. And that horse, he pointed at Sable, cannot climb where goats turn back. She is calm, Matea said. She does not panic. She will go where I go if I go slowly. And if the trail narrows past her shoulders, then I find out before sunrise. Cade stared at her for a long time. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth, a hoof pick, sharp and clean. Keep her feet clear of packed snow, he said. Packed snow lames a horse faster than rocks do. He turned and walked out into the sleet without looking back. Matea waited until the stable was silent. She listened for footsteps in the main building. She heard Prowl's door close on the second floor. She heard the younger children shifting on their cots. She heard the kitchen girl banking what was left of the stove fire with ash. She bridled Sable with the halter rope, not the bit. A bit clicked against teeth and sound carried in cold air. She tied the cornmeal sack and the blanket across the mare's back with the girth strap she had taken from the tack wall 3 days ago, one piece at a time so no one would notice everything missing at once. She pulled her shawl tight, put the matches in her deepest pocket, and led Sable out through the south side of the stable where the canvas flap opened onto frozen pasture. The sleet had turned to snow. Matea could not see more than 40 feet ahead. That was fine. She did not need to see far. She needed to see the ground directly in front of Sable's hooves, and she needed to feel the mare's shoulder against her arm, and she needed to keep walking south until the land dropped away and the canyon swallowed them both. They crossed the pasture fence through a gap where the lower rail had rotted out. Matea had loosened the remaining rail 2 weeks earlier, 1 inch each day, so that on this night it swung free without noise. She had not known she would need it on this specific night. She had known she would need it eventually. Some preparations do not have dates. They have directions. The ground began to slope within a 1/4 mile. Juniper scrub thickened. The snow fell harder, but the wind dropped as the canyon walls rose on either side, funneling them into the narrow drainage. Sable's hooves crunched on frozen gravel. Matea's boots slipped twice, and each time she grabbed a fistful of the mare's mane, and the mare did not flinch. By the time the canyon floor leveled and the walls pressed close enough to touch with outstretched arms, Matea could no longer see the orphanage lights behind her. She could not see much of anything. The sky was a narrow strip of dark gray between black walls. Snow fell through the gap like flour through a sieve. She was looking for the trail. The ledge she remembered was on the east wall, somewhere above the canyon floor, reached by a track that deer had cut over centuries of moving between water and high ground. In October, she had seen it in daylight, a pale scar angling upward across dark stone, wide enough in most places for a careful person on foot. She had not walked it. She had not tested it for a horse. Now she needed to find it in the dark. She slowed Sable and pressed her right hand against the canyon wall, walking forward with her fingers reading the stone. Sandstone, cold and gritty, with ridges where harder layers resisted erosion. She felt for the break, the place where the wall's angle changed, where the ledge began its upward cut. 20 minutes passed. Her fingers went numb. Sable's breathing was steady, but her ears rotated constantly, tracking sounds Matea could not hear. Then her hand found open air where stone should have been. A gap. A shelf of rock jutting outward, and below it, a ramp of eroded rubble rising at an angle that was steep but not vertical. Matea stopped. She put her hand on Sable's nose. "This is it," she said. The mare's nostrils flared. She smelled the rock, the dampness, the faint mineral tang of seep water somewhere above. She did not pull back. Matea led her onto the first incline. The rubble shifted under the mare's weight. Loose stones rolled downhill and clattered into the canyon floor. Matea's heart hammered in her throat. If Sable slipped here, the mare would slide into the drainage and could break a foreleg on the uneven ground. But Sable did not slip. She planted each hoof deliberately, testing the surface before committing her weight. She moved the way she moved when hauling a loaded wagon up an icy grade, slowly, with her center of gravity low and her neck extended for balance. She had done this work 1,000 times. The terrain was different. The principle was the same. The trail narrowed. In places, the outer edge crumbled where frost had split the stone. Matea walked on the inside, one hand on the wall, one hand on the mare's halter. She could feel Sable's shoulder brushing the cliff face. She could hear the mare's iron shoes scraping on bare rock where snow had not settled. At one switchback, the trail pinched to less than 4 feet wide. Matea stopped. Sable's barrel was nearly 4 feet across at the ribs. The mare would have to angle through, and if she panicked midway, there was no room to turn. Matea did not pull. She did not push. She removed the halter entirely, stepped through the narrow section, turned, and called Sable's name once, quietly, the way she said it every morning in the stable, when the mare lifted her head at the sound and walked to her without being led. Sable stood on the far side of the pinch point. Her ears came forward. She lowered her head, measured the gap with her nose the way she measured doorways, and stepped through sideways, one hoof at a time, her ribs brushing both walls. A stone the size of a man's fist broke free from the outer edge and fell into darkness. Matea did not hear it land. The mare cleared the gap. Matea reattached the halter with hands that shook. They climbed for another 20 minutes. The trail widened again. The snow fell less heavily here because the cliff above acted as a partial roof. And then, in the pre-dawn gray, Matea saw what she had been walking toward since October. The alcove opened like a mouth in the cliff face. It was broad, perhaps 30 feet across at the front, deepening 20 feet or more into the rock. The ceiling curved overhead, stained black in places from ancient smoke. Low stone walls crumbled and scattered, marked where rooms had once been. At the back, where the overhang was deepest, the stone was dry despite the snow, and along the left wall a dark streak glistened. Water. Slow. Steady. Seeping through sandstone that had been filtering snow melt and rain for longer than anyone alive could count. Matea stood at the entrance and pressed her palm against the rear wall. It was warm, not hot, not even room temperature, but warmer than the air, warmer than the canyon floor, warmer than anything she had touched since the kitchen stove went cold. The stone had spent the day collecting whatever thin December sun reached this south-facing surface, and now Hours after sunset, it was giving that heat back into the sheltered air. She closed her eyes. She heard Rosario's voice, as clearly as if the woman were standing beside her. Stone remembers heat longer than people remember kindness. She opened her eyes and looked at Sable. The mare had already walked to the back of the alcove and was standing with her head low, her breathing even, her muscles releasing tension Matea had not realized the animal was carrying. The horse knew what shelter felt like. Matea set down the cornmeal sack. She unwrapped the blanket. She sat against the warm wall with the wool across her knees and the mare's body blocking the wind from the entrance. She had made it, but making it to the alcove was not the same as surviving in it. The cornmeal would last 4 days if she ate one handful 3 times daily. The oats would keep Sable from starving for 2 days, no more. The seep gave water, but not warmth. The alcove gave warmth during the day, but the question was whether it could hold enough heat through a winter night to keep her alive until morning. The opening was 22 feet wide. Wind poured through it like water through a broken dam. The warm wall was 20 feet deep, and every degree of stored heat was bleeding out into the December air. Without a barrier, the alcove was a shelter the way a roofless barn was a shelter, better than nothing and not enough by half. Matea needed to reduce that opening. She needed mass between her and the wind. She needed the alcove to hold its heat the way a stove holds coals, sealed enough to keep warmth in, open enough to keep air moving so she and Sable did not suffocate. She could not build a cabin. She had no saw, no nails, no lumber. What she had was fallen stone. The alcove floor was littered with sandstone blocks, pieces of old walls that had tumbled from the ancient rooms, mixed with chunks of ceiling and frost-split rubble from the cliff above. Some weighed more than she could lift. Most were between 10 and 60 pounds. There were hundreds of them. She also had mud. The seep kept the left wall perpetually damp, and where water met the sandy floor, the ground was soft enough to dig with a tin cup and pack into the gaps between stones. She had juniper. Dead trees clung to the ledge trail and the cliff face above the alcove, killed by drought and preserved by dry air. Their wood was brittle and would burn fast, but their branches were dense enough to weave into a barrier. And she had Sable. 1,900 pounds of living heat, generating warmth from every pound of feed she consumed, breathing moist air that carried calories into the space, standing as a windbreak simply by existing. The plan formed not as a single idea, but as a series of small recognitions. Rosario showing her how mud packed into stone joints hardened into something nearly as strong as mortar. Rosario pressing her palm against the orphanage's adobe wall at dusk and saying, "Feel that? That is this morning's sun. The wall is giving it back." The way Sable's stall stayed warmer than the tack room even when both had no stove, because the mare's body filled the smaller space with heat the wood walls held just long enough. If Matea could close that 22-foot opening to a gap just wide enough to enter, and if she could build the wall thick enough to slow the wind, and if she could keep Sable inside where the mare's heat had nowhere to go but into the stone, then the alcove would do what no cabin without fuel could do. It would hold warmth from 3 sources, sun, stone, and horse, and release it slowly enough to keep the temperature above freezing through the night. It was not a house. It was a principle. And the principle had been proven 1,000 years before Matea was born by people who built these walls because they understood that surviving winter was not about making heat. It was about keeping heat from leaving. She looked at the ancient walls with different eyes, not as ruins, as instructions. She said aloud to the dark stone and the silent alcove and the mare who stood watching her with the patience of something twice her age, Someone lived here because someone knew how. She picked up the first stone. It weighed perhaps 30 pounds. She carried it to the front of the alcove and set it where the wind cut sharpest. She went back for another and another. Her hands split before dawn. Nell Custis found Matea in the stable 2 days before the escape, though Matea did not know then that it mattered. Nell was 17, tall, quick-fingered, and practical in the way that orphans who survived to 17 had to be. She worked the kitchen and stole food more skillfully than anyone else in the building, not out of greed, but out of a precise understanding that the portions Prawl approved were not sufficient for growing bodies. Nell had watched Matea take the girth strap. She had watched her measure Sable's hoof spread against a plank. She had watched her wrap extra cornmeal in cloth and hide it in the grain bin. On the night before the escape, Nell cornered Matea in the hallway outside the laundry. "You are leaving," Nell said. It was not a question. Matea said nothing. "Where?" "You do not want to know." "I know already. The canyon. You think you can stable a horse inside a mountain." "I think I can keep her alive." "For how long? 2 days? 3? You have 4 pounds of meal and no stove. That horse eats 10 pounds of hay a day, and you have handfuls of stolen oats. She will eat through everything you have, foul the air in whatever hole you find, and when she dies, and she will die, Matea, you will be trapped with a carcass that weighs a ton." Matea looked at Nell for a long time. Then she said, "She kept me warm first." Nell blinked. She did not understand. She did not need to. The sentence was not an argument. It was a fact that Matea carried the way other people carried prayers, something that did not need to be rational to be true. Nell stepped aside. Matea walked past her toward the stable, and Nell stood in the hallway with her arms crossed and her jaw tight, because she knew 2 things. Matea was going to die in that canyon, and there was nothing Nell could do to stop someone who had already decided that freedom with a horse in a frozen gulch was better than survival in Prawl's building. By noon on December 12th, Prawl had shaped the story. He stood in the Mercantile on Mancos's main street, speaking to the owner and 2 ranchers who had come in for wire. "The Rourke girl stole my draft mare," Prawl said. $90 animal. Took feed, took tack, went over the fence in the night. One rancher asked which direction. "South," Prawl said. "Toward the canyon, which means she is dead already, or she will be by tomorrow. Either way, I need the horse recovered." The Mercantile owner shook his head. "No girl takes a horse that size into Box Canyon country. She went to the road." "My liveryman says the tracks go south." "Then your liveryman should go get her." He refused. The ranchers exchanged a look. A girl stealing a horse was one thing. A man refusing to pursue was another. It suggested the story had gaps. At the livery, a different version was forming. Cade said nothing about where Matea had gone. When men asked, he said the weather was too bad to track anyone, and that Prawl should report the theft to the deputy when the roads cleared. This was technically reasonable advice. It was also a delay that gave Matea hours she needed, but Cade did not believe she would survive. He told his stable hand, a boy of 14 named Porter, "If the storm breaks by Thursday, ride the canyon mouth and listen. If you hear the horse, come tell me. If you hear nothing, we will go in after the thaw for what is left." He expected to find bodies. Prawl confronted Cade directly that afternoon, standing in the livery doorway with snow on his shoulders and his ledger book under his arm, as if the numbers inside it constituted a warrant. "I want men in that canyon tonight," Prawl said. Cade studied the sky. The clouds were the color of a bruise, and they stretched from horizon to horizon without a break. "No," Cade said. "That mare is worth $90. "Then you should have cared more who loved her." Prawl's face went red. "I care who owns her." You own a building full of children who have no coal. Fix that first. The coal is not your concern. Neither is the canyon, not tonight. Cade turned his back. Prawl stood in the doorway for a full minute, his breath making clouds that the wind tore apart. Then he left. He did not go to the deputy. He did not organize a search. He went back to his office and sat behind his mining company desk and waited for the canyon to solve his problem for him. If Matea died, the story was simple. A troubled girl stole a horse and perished in the wilderness. Prawl would file the loss, collect sympathy, and write off the mare. If Matea survived, the story became dangerous. A girl who ran because the headmaster sold her horse and planned to sell her labor. A girl whose survival proved that she had been desperate enough to risk death rather than stay. Prawl needed the canyon to kill her. It was the cleanest solution. And December in southwest Colorado was reliable. In the alcove, Matea did not know any of this. She knew only the stone and the wind and the weight of each block she carried. The first day she stacked 47 stones along the alcove's opening, working from the east side where the wind hit hardest. Each stone had to be fitted against its neighbor without mortar, because the mud from the seep took hours to freeze hard enough to hold. She packed what she could into the larger gaps and filled smaller cracks with dead juniper branches stripped of their needles. By nightfall, she had a wall 3 feet high and 2 feet thick along the eastern half of the opening. It was not enough. Wind poured over the top and through the western gap as if the wall did not exist. But when Matea sat behind it with her back to the rear stone, she could feel the difference. The air on the sheltered side moved less. Sable's breath hung longer before dissolving. The candle she could not afford to light would have flickered less here than at the entrance. Her hands bled where the rough sandstone had torn the skin. Her shoulders ached from lifting. She had eaten 1 handful of cornmeal mixed with seep water, a cold paste that sat in her stomach like wet sand. Zabel had eaten the last oats and was nosing the bare ground for anything resembling grass. The temperature dropped further after dark. Matea wrapped herself in the army blanket, pressed against Sable's side, and lay against the rear wall. The stone was warm enough to feel through the wool. Not warm enough to stop her shivering, but the shivering did not worsen as the hours passed. It held steady, which meant the heat leaving the wall was roughly matching the heat leaving her body. She was not gaining ground. She was not losing it either. She slept in fragments, waking each time Sable shifted or the wind changed pitch. Twice she got up to repack juniper into gaps the wind had loosened. Once she held her hand in front of a crack and felt air moving outward, the alcove exhaling warmer air through the breach. Every leak was a loss. Every loss was a degree she might need at 4 a.m. when the stone had given back its last reserve. She did not know if this was enough. She did not know if the wall could be built high enough, thick enough, dense enough to hold the heat that the sun would deliver tomorrow, if there was sun tomorrow. She did not know if Sable could survive on willow bark and dry grass scraped from under ledges. She did not know if Prawl would send men after her, or if the canyon would close with snow before she could finish. What she knew was the weight of the next stone in her hands. She knew the angle of the wall. She knew the taste of cold cornmeal paste and the sound of a horse breathing in a space where the air was 3 degrees warmer than it should have been. And she knew that someone a very long time ago had stood in this same alcove and solved this same problem with these same materials. The low walls at the back were proof. The smoke stains on the ceiling were proof. The seep, still running after centuries, was proof that this place held what it was given and released it slowly. She was not inventing anything. She was remembering something that the stone had never forgotten. Tell us in the comments. Have you ever been doubted by someone who did not understand what you were building? Matea had not proven anything yet, but for the first time, In the silence of a place that should have killed her, the stone was answering back. By the second morning, she had extended the wall to 4 feet high across 2/3 of the opening. Her arms trembled when she lifted stones above her waist. Her lips were cracked, and her throat was raw from breathing cold air through the night. Sable stood near the rear wall, patient and gaunt, her ribs beginning to show where fat had been a week ago. Matea cut willow bark from a scrub tree on the ledge and brought armfuls of dead grass from beneath rock overhangs along the trail. It was not enough to feed a horse that burned calories like a furnace, but it was enough to keep Sable's gut moving, and a moving gut generated heat. Matea did not know this as science. She knew it as observation. A horse that stopped eating stopped warming. Every handful of dried grass was a match she did not have to strike. The sun appeared at mid-morning, low and thin through scattered clouds. It entered the alcove at an angle that struck the rear wall fully for perhaps 3 hours. Matea watched the frost melt first on the stone at the back, not on the floor, not on the side walls, but on the dark rear surface where the alcove's depth focused the light like a shallow bowl. By early afternoon, that wall was warm enough that she could press both palms flat against it and feel heat moving into her bones. She understood then, fully, what Rosario had been teaching her all along. Not about adobe, not about laundry steam, about the difference between heat and the memory of heat. A fire made heat and spent it into the air, where it rose and vanished. A stone wall absorbed heat and held it, releasing it slowly over hours, the way a creek bank releases water after rain. The alcove was not a stove. It was a bank. And the sun was making a deposit that Matea needed to last until morning. But the opening was still too wide, the wall was still too low, and the storm that had been building all week was not done. She picked up another stone. Her palms were wet with blood and seep water. The wind cut through the western gap and stole whatever warmth the sun had given. Sable shifted and lowered her head, and Matea looked at the mare and the wall and the canyon below and the clouds closing in from the west. And she thought, I am building a door one stone at a time, and I do not know if I will finish before the cold walks through it. The wall was rising. The wall was not rising fast enough, and somewhere behind her, in a building with no coal and a man with a ledger, the world had already written her off. On the third morning, Matea found a twist of blue thread tied to a juniper branch on the ledge trail 30 feet below the alcove. She stared at it. The thread was cotton, dyed indigo, the kind used to mark laundry bundles at the orphanage. No animal had tied it there. No wind had wrapped it in a knot that held against the gusts that raked the cliff face. Someone had climbed partway up the trail and left a sign. Behind the juniper, wedged into a crack in the rock, she found a small cloth packet. Inside was a fistful of salt and a folded scrap of paper. The paper was damp at the edges, but the pencil marks were legible. It said, "Do not seal the air." Matea read it twice. She looked down the trail. She saw no one. The canyon floor was white with fresh snow, and the only tracks visible were her own from the previous day, already half filled. She knew the handwriting. She had seen it on laundry tallies and on the labels Rosario Valdez tied to clean bundles before stacking them in the orphanage hall. Rosario wrote her letters small and tight, with the R leaning forward as if in a hurry to reach the next word. Rosario was alive. Rosario knew where she was, and Rosario had climbed into the canyon, a 54-year-old woman with bad knees and a cough that never fully cleared, to leave a warning Matea had not yet earned. Do not seal the air. Matea looked at her wall. She had been packing every crack, filling every gap, plugging every opening she could reach. She had been thinking of the wind as the enemy and the wall as the weapon. Rosario was telling her she was wrong. Not about the wall, about the air. A sealed room killed. Matea knew this the way she knew boiling water steamed, not from books, but from living in a building where the kitchen filled with smoke every time the chimney damper stuck. A horse breathing in a closed space consumed the good air and replaced it with what came out of its lungs and its gut. A person did the same. Seal the alcove completely, and the warmth that saved her would sit in air too foul to breathe. She would not freeze. She would simply stop waking up. She needed the wall. She needed it incomplete. That afternoon, Matea changed her design. She stopped filling the upper gaps. She left a space the width of her forearm near the ceiling on the western side, where the natural curve of the alcove's roof created a channel. She also left the shoulder-wide entrance on the east side, but hung the army blanket across it on a juniper pole so the wind had to push through fabric before entering. The blanket flapped and snapped in gusts, but it broke the direct flow. She tested the ventilation the only way she could. She struck one of her 8 matches, now 7, and held the flame near the low entrance. It guttered but did not go out. She held it near the high gap. It bent outward, pulled by moving air. Warm air was rising inside the alcove, escaping through the high gap, drawing fresh, cold air in through the low entrance. The alcove was breathing. She did not understand the physics in words. She understood it in her hands. The match told her what she needed to know. On the 4th day, Rosario came. Matea was on the ledge trail, cutting dead juniper with her dull knife, when she heard footsteps below. Slow, deliberate, with the shuffling rhythm of someone whose joints protested every incline. She pressed against the cliff wall and waited. A figure appeared around the lower switchback, wrapped in a dark wool rebozo, carrying a canvas sack over one shoulder that made her list to the right with each step. Rosario Valdez was 54 years old. She had been born in a village south of Abiquiu, in the territory of New Mexico, daughter of a mason who built adobe walls for ranchers and churches along the Chama River. She had married a teamster who died of typhus in '68, leaving her with a skill set that included plastering, mortar mixing, laundry chemistry, and the ability to judge the load-bearing capacity of a mud wall by pressing her thumb into the surface. She had come to Colorado following work and had stayed at the orphanage because someone needed to do the laundry, and because the children needed at least one adult who did not view them as a cost column in a ledger. She reached the alcove entrance, breathing hard, her face flushed under brown skin, her hands red with cold. She set the canvas sack on the ground and looked at Matea's wall. She said nothing for a full minute. She walked the length of it, running her hand along the face, pressing her thumb into the mud joints, testing the lean with her palm flat against the surface. She crouched and looked at the base, where Matea had set the largest stones as a foundation. She stood and looked at the high gap and the blanket-covered entrance. "The base is good," Rosario said. "The top leans out. I could not stack higher without it leaning, because you built it straight. A wall in wind leans in, batter, like this." Rosario picked up a flat stone, perhaps 15 pounds, and placed it against the wall's upper course at a slight inward angle. When wind pushes, the wall pushes back. A straight wall fights the wind. A battered wall uses it. She showed Matea how to reset the top course, tilting each stone so the face sloped inward by roughly 1 inch per foot of height. It meant dismantling a section Matea had spent hours building. Matea did it without argument. She understood correction. Correction from someone who knew what they were doing was not criticism, it was material. From the canvas sack, Rosario produced 3 things: a half-pound of dried beans, a twist of tallow wrapped in cloth, and a cracked spirit thermometer in a leather sleeve. "The beans are mine," Rosario said. "The tallow is from the kitchen stores. I will replace it before Prawl counts. The thermometer came from the laundry. He never used it and will not notice." "Why are you here?" Matea asked. Rosario looked at the rear wall, where the stone was dark with absorbed heat and the seep line glistened faintly. "Because you built the wall low enough to breathe," Rosario said. "If you had sealed it, I would have turned around. A girl who seals a room with a horse inside does not understand what she is doing. You left the gap. That means you are thinking." She paused. "And because I have read those walls," she pointed to the ancient rooms at the back of the alcove, the low crumbled partitions, and the smoke-stained ceiling. "My father built for people who understood stone. These walls were built by people who understood stone before my father's people arrived. I cannot let you die in a place that was built to keep people alive." They worked together for the rest of the day. Rosario showed Matea the second critical skill, vent reading. She twisted a length of dried grass into a tight rope, lit the end with one of Matea's matches, 6 remaining, and held the smoking twist near every crack, gap, and opening in the wall and ceiling. "Watch the smoke," Rosario said. "If it goes in, cold air enters there. If it goes out, warm air leaves there. You want cold in low and warm out high, like a chimney. If the smoke goes nowhere, the air is dead. Dead air kills before cold does." The smoke threads told a story Matea could not have read without them. The army blanket entrance pulled cold air inward along the floor. The high gap on the west side exhaled warm air steadily, but a crack in the eastern wall, hidden behind a juniper branch Matea had wedged in place, was pulling warm air out at waist height. A leak that cost heat without providing ventilation. They packed it with mud and stone. The temperature inside the alcove rose by an amount Matea could not measure, but could feel in the change from constant shivering to intermittent shivering. The third lesson came at dusk. Rosario had Matea identify the stones on the rear wall that received the most direct sun during the day. There were 5 of them, each roughly the size of a man's torso, dark-colored and set in the natural sandstone face where centuries of smoke had stained them even darker. "These are your stove," Rosario said. "Not fire, sun. The dark stone takes more heat. Feel." Matea placed her palms on one of the dark stones. It was warmer than the surrounding rock by a margin she could detect immediately. "Now feel the floor." Cold. The floor was exposed to the entrance gap and had no direct sun after mid-afternoon. "Tonight," Rosario said, "move your pallet against these stones, not on the floor in the middle, against the wall. You sleep where the heat sleeps." Matea moved her blanket. That night, with Sable's bulk blocking the lower entrance gap and the rear wall radiating stored heat into her back, she slept for 4 hours without waking. It was the longest unbroken sleep she had gotten since leaving the orphanage. Rosario also taught Sable care that Matea had not considered. Never let the mare drink seep water too fast when her body was cold. The shock could cramp the gut. Rub the mare's legs after any climb, working from the knee down to the hoof to push blood back into tissues that cold had tightened. Pick the hooves twice daily, because packed snow in the sole acted like an ice block strapped to the foot and could lame a horse in days. Cade had told Matea the same thing with the hoof pick. Rosario told her why. "A horse does not complain," Rosario said. "She adjusts. She shifts her weight. She stops moving. By the time you see the limp, the damage is old. You have to look before the limp every day." They fell into a rhythm. Mornings. Matea rebuilt sections of the wall where frost had cracked the mud. Rosario gathered dead juniper and cut willow bark for Sable's feed. Afternoons, they tracked the sun's path across the rear wall, noting which stones heated first and which cooled last. Evenings, they ate small portions of cornmeal paste mixed with beans, calculated the remaining food against the days ahead, and said little because the numbers did not encourage conversation. The food math was brutal. Between the cornmeal, the beans, and what Rosario had brought, they had perhaps 6 days of human food at starvation rations. Sable needed 10 pounds of forage daily to maintain body heat. The dead grass and willow bark Matea could gather from the ledge and canyon walls provided perhaps 3 pounds. The horse was burning fat reserves she could not replace. By the 6th day in the alcove, Sable's ribs showed clearly under her black coat. Her hip bones stood sharper. She ate everything Matea brought her and nosed the ground for more. She was not starving yet. She was heading there. On the 7th day, Nell Custis appeared. Matea heard the footsteps first, faster than Rosario's, lighter, with the uneven cadence of someone climbing in boots too large for their feet. Nell came around the switchback with a burlap sack bouncing against her hip, and her face the color of ash from cold and exertion. She stopped at the alcove entrance. She looked at the wall. She looked at Sable standing against the rear stone. She looked at Matea, who was kneeling at the seep line with the tin cup, catching water that dripped at the rate of 1 cup every 20 minutes. "I still think you're going to die," Nell said. "You climbed a canyon in December to tell me that?" Nell set the sack down. Inside was roughly 8 pounds of beet pulp, the compressed fiber left after sugar beets were processed, used as cheap livestock feed. She had also brought a hoof pick, sharp and clean, likely stolen from the livery. "The beet pulp is from the feed room. Prawl does not count it because he thinks it is waste." Nell looked at Sable. The mare had lifted her head at the smell of feed. "She's thin." "She is working hard." Nell walked to the rear wall and placed her hand flat against the stone, the way she had seen Matea do. Her expression changed, not dramatically. A slight widening of the eyes, a shift in the set of her jaw, as if a question she had been carrying had received an answer she did not expect. "It is warm," Nell said. "It has been warm since the sun hit it 6 hours ago. It will stay warm until sometime after midnight." "How warm?" Matea pointed to the cracked thermometer Rosario had hung on a juniper peg near the rear wall. It read 61 degrees. At the entrance, the air was 32. Nell stared at the thermometer. She stared at the wall. She looked at the ancient smoke stains on the ceiling and the crumbled walls of rooms that had held families 1,000 years before either of them was born. She did not say anything for a long time. Then she said, "I brought the hoof pick because I thought at least the horse deserved clean feet before she died." "She is not going to die." "You do not know that." "No, but the wall does." Nell left before dark. She took the trail down to the canyon floor and disappeared into the gray light. She did not say she would return. She did not say she believed. But she had touched the warm stone, and she had gone quiet, and for the first time in Matea's experience, Nell Custis had nothing practical to say against what she was seeing. The beet pulp changed the math. 8 pounds of compressed feed, mixed with warm seep water and dried grass, gave Sable 3 days of adequate forage instead of the 1 day Matea had been counting on. The mare ate the first mash with the slow thoroughness of an animal that understood scarcity. When she finished, she stood against the rear wall and lowered her head and slept standing, her weight on 3 legs, her breathing deep and even. On the clear days, The alcove worked the way Matea and Rosario had designed it. The spirit thermometer told the story in numbers. At noon, with full sun on the rear wall, the stone surface reached 68 degrees. The air near the back of the alcove held at 55 to 60. At the entrance, past the wall, the temperature hovered at freezing. After midnight, the rear wall cooled to 52, then 46 by dawn. The floor was colder. The entrance was coldest. But the core of the space, the area where Matea slept and Sable stood, stayed above 40 through the night. It was not 70 degrees, it was not tropical, but a person wrapped in wool against a 46-degree wall with a 1,900-pound animal radiating heat 3 feet away did not freeze. The body could hold its own temperature in that range. It was uncomfortable. It was survivable. Rosario came and went through the first week, always arriving with something small, a handful of dried chili, a strip of cloth for binding Matea's cracked hands, a scrap of rope. Each visit added a lesson. She showed Matea how to position dark, flat stones where the sun struck the floor, turning the ground into a secondary heat bank. She showed her how to hang the army blanket not flat across the entrance, but angled so it created a small vestibule, a dead air space that slowed the wind without blocking it completely. On one visit, they disagreed. Rosario wanted Matea to build a second interior wall separating Sable's space from her sleeping area to control the horse's breath moisture and contain the manure smell. Matea refused. "She is my heat source," Matea said. "If I wall her off, I lose the warmth." "If you do not wall her off, her breath soaks the blankets, and wet wool does not insulate. Then I dry the blankets on the warm stones during the day." Rosario looked at her for a long moment. "That is more work." "Everything here is more work. I would rather work than be cold," Rosario conceded. It was the first time Matea had pushed back against the older woman's judgment, and Rosario accepted it without resentment. She recognized the calculation. Matea was not rejecting advice. She was weighing two costs and choosing the one she could pay. Tolliver Cade came to the canyon mouth on the 9th day. He did not climb the trail. He stood at the base and shouted upward into the wind, his voice broken by gusts. "Rourke, you alive?" Matea appeared at the ledge above him. She was thinner than when he had last seen her. Her shawl was tied around her waist because she was sweating from hauling stone. Sweating in December, in a canyon that was supposed to kill her. Cade stared. "The horse?" he called. "Alive, thin, eating." "Prawl filed a report with the deputy. Says you stole $90 of livestock." "He was going to sell her to a freight contractor and send me to the mines. You know this." Cade was quiet for a moment. "I know what he said. I do not know what the deputy believes." "What do you believe?" "I believe a warm stone at noon is not a roof at midnight." He paused. "But you are still standing, so what do I know?" He left without climbing. He did not offer help. He did not offer food. But he also did not report her location, and in a community where Prawl's version of events was the only version circulating, that silence was worth more than beans. Rosario left the alcove on the afternoon of the 12th day, promising to return in 2 days with more beet pulp. She had arranged to buy it from a ranch hand who owed her a favor and who did not ask what a laundress needed with horse feed. The sky that afternoon was clear, but the western horizon was the wrong color, not gray, not white, a yellowish brown that Matea had seen once before, in October, when a 3-day wind had turned the sky to dust. This was different. This was moisture, a wall of cloud moving from the northwest with the slow, deliberate weight of something that intended to stay. Rosario saw it too. She stood on the ledge trail and looked west for a long time. "Finish the wall today." she said. The upper course. Batter it in. Pack every joint you can reach. Leave the vent and the entrance. Close everything else. How bad? I was a child when the winter of '62 hit the Chama. The sheep froze standing up. My father said the snow came sideways for 4 days, and the only survivors were the ones who had walls between them and the wind before the wind arrived. She looked at Matea. You have a wall. Finish it. She descended the trail slowly, one hand on the rock, the other clutching her rebozo. Matea watched her until she disappeared around the lower switchback. Then she turned back to the alcove and began stacking stone. The Whiteout arrived before dawn on the 14th day. Matea woke to a sound she had never heard, a continuous low roar, like water pouring through a pipe. Except the pipe was the canyon, and the water was wind-driving snow horizontally through the gap between the walls. The temperature had dropped so far so fast that the seep had slowed to a thread. The army blanket at the entrance was frozen stiff, standing nearly on its own, crusted white with ice. She crawled to the entrance and looked out. She could not see the canyon floor. She could not see the ledge trail. She could not see anything beyond the wall except a white-gray void that moved and screamed. Snow drove past the opening with a velocity that stung the exposed skin of her face before she pulled back. Sable was standing at the rear wall, trembling. Not from cold. The rear stone was still warm from the previous day's sun. From fear. The sound was wrong. The pressure in the air was wrong. Every equine instinct was telling the mare to run, and there was nowhere to run. Matea went to her. She pressed her forehead against the mare's neck and stood there until the trembling eased. She spoke to the horse the way she always spoke, low, steady, with words that carried no information but the sound of a person who was not leaving. The first hour was the worst she had known. Wind found the cracks she had missed. Snow dust sprayed through the high vent and through gaps in the wall where mud had not fully set. The floor near the entrance was white within minutes. The temperature at the entrance dropped below anything the thermometer could show. The mercury sat at the bottom of the glass and did not move. But at the rear wall, the thermometer read 44. The stone was releasing heat it had stored over the past 3 clear days, and the wall, Rosario's battered, inward-leaning wall, was holding. Wind hit the outer face and pushed the upper course tighter against itself. Juniper branches packed in the gaps flexed, but did not pull free. The mud joints cracked in places, but the stones behind them did not shift. The alcove was breathing. Cold air entered low through the blanket entrance, moved across the floor, warmed as it passed Sable's body in the rear wall, rose toward the ceiling, and escaped through the high vent. The cycle was slow, but it was continuous. The air inside the alcove was not fresh, exactly. It smelled of horse and damp wool and old stone. But it was air that could be breathed, and it was air that was warmer than the killing wind outside. The first day passed in a blur of small crises. A section of wall near the floor shifted when ice formed between stones, and Matea had to repack it with bare hands because her gloves— she had no gloves. She had never had gloves— were a fantasy. Her fingers went white. She plunged them under Sable's belly, against the warm skin between the forelegs, and held them there until sensation returned as pain. The seep slowed further. She caught half a cup in 2 hours. She melted snow from the entrance in her tin cup, holding it against the warm rear wall until it turned to water that tasted of stone dust and ice. By the second morning, she had rationed herself down to 1 handful of cornmeal and 2 bites of bean paste per day. Sable had the last of the beet pulp mash, stretched with dried grass and warm water. The horse ate slowly, chewing each mouthful until every calorie was extracted. When the mash was gone, Sable licked the stone where the water had been mixed. Matea curled against the rear wall with a blanket over her legs and her back against the stone. She could feel the heat leaving. The wall that had been 68 degrees at noon 2 days ago was now 44 and falling. Without sun, the stone was a bank with no deposits and a steady withdrawal. She was spending heat she could not replace. If the storm lasted one more day, the rear wall would fall to 38 or 35, still above freezing, still survivable if she had food and if Sable's body heat filled the space. If it lasted 3 days without sun, the wall would equalize with the floor, and the advantage would shrink to nothing. The alcove would become a cold room with a wind wall, better than open ground. Not enough to sustain life. On the second evening of the whiteout, Matea heard something through a gap in the wind's roar. A voice, thin, broken by gusts, coming from below the ledge trail. She went to the entrance. Snow had drifted against the outer face of the wall to a height of 3 feet. She pulled the frozen blanket aside and leaned out into the wind. Matea! The voice was Nell's. Matea's chest seized. Nell was somewhere on the canyon floor, in the whiteout, at night, in a storm that had already buried the trail under 2 feet of snow. She called back. The wind took her voice and shattered it. She called again. She heard nothing for a full minute, then, faintly, a cough. Below and to the east, somewhere between the trail's first switchback and the canyon floor, Nell had tried to bring food. She had entered the canyon before the storm's second wave hit, and she had been caught in the open when the visibility dropped to nothing. Matea looked at Sable. The mare's ears were forward, tracking the sound. The horse could hear what Matea could not: the exact direction, the exact distance, the exact quality of distress in a human voice filtered through wind and stone. There was no question. Matea tied the halter rope around her waist and looped the other end around Sable's neck, not as control, but as contact. If she fell, the rope would stop her. If Sable fell, the rope would tell Matea before the sound did. She led the mare out of the alcove and onto the ledge trail. The world outside was a white roar. Snow hit her face like thrown sand. The trail was invisible under drifted powder. She could feel the edge with her left foot, the place where solid stone ended and empty air began, and she moved by that sensation alone, one step at a time, her right hand on the cliff wall, her left hand on the halter rope. Sable followed. The mare moved with the same deliberate patience she had shown on the first night climb, each hoof testing the surface before bearing weight. But the surface was different now. The snow hid the stone's shape. Footholds that had been reliable were buried. Gaps that had been visible were filled with powder that looked solid and was not. At the first switchback, the trail narrowed. Sable's hind hoof struck the outer edge, and a section of frozen stone broke free and tumbled into the canyon. The sound it made falling, a clatter, then a crack, then silence, told Matea how far down the floor was. 60 feet, maybe more. She stopped. She went flat against the cliff wall and gave Sable slack. The mare stood with her weight shifted forward, breathing hard, her front hooves braced against solid rock and her rear hooves uncertain. Matea did not pull. She did not call. She waited. After 10 seconds that felt like minutes, Sable adjusted. She shifted her right rear hoof inward, found the trail's solid core, and settled her weight. They continued down. If you are invested in this story, stay with us, because the next few steps decide whether Matea's shelter becomes a refuge or a tomb. Matea found Nell at the base of the first switchback, pressed against the canyon wall with her arms wrapped around her torso. Nell's coat was soaked through. Her fingers were white and stiff. Her speech was slurred, the words running together like water over flat stone. Could not find the trail, walked past it, turned back. Could not. Matea could not carry her. Nell was her height and nearly her weight, and the trail back up was too narrow and too steep for Matea to support another person while climbing. She needed the horse. She pressed Sable's shoulder. The mare had been trained to kneel for loading heavy laundry sacks onto a low wagon bed. Rosario had taught her this, patiently, with a voice command and a downward pressure on the halter. Matea gave the command now, pressing the halter down and back. Sable hesitated. The ground was wrong. The surface was snow over stone, not the stable floor she associated with kneeling. But the voice was right. The hand was right. The mare folded her front legs and lowered her chest to the ground. Matea dragged Nell across the mare's back, chest down over the saddle pad that was still tied in place from the escape. She used strips torn from the army blanket to lash Nell's arms to the girth strap. Nell's head hung on one side and her legs on the other. It was not dignified. It was secure. "Up," Matea said. Sable rose. The mare staggered slightly under the uneven load, then steadied. Nell groaned. Matea took the halter rope and began climbing. The return took 40 minutes. 40 minutes of blind climbing, feeling for the trail with numb feet, listening for Sable's hooves behind her, stopping each time the mare paused, trusting the horse's judgment about the surface more than her own. At the narrow point, she had Sable angle through sideways again, this time with Nell's body catching on the wall, and Matea pushing the girl's legs clear while the mare inched past the pinch. They reached the alcove. Matea pulled the blanket aside and guided Sable through the entrance. She untied Nell and lowered her to the ground against the rear wall. Nell's skin was gray. Her breathing was shallow. Her clothes were soaked and the wet fabric was pulling heat from her body faster than the wall could replace it. 3 bodies now. The system had been built for 1 person and 1 horse. Now there were 2 people, 1 horse, and the second person was hypothermic and soaking wet. Matea stripped Nell's coat and outer shirt, wrung them over the stone floor, and hung them on a juniper peg near, but not against, the rear wall. Wet wool against warm stone would create steam that raised humidity and dampened everything in the alcove. Hung in the air near the wall, the clothes would dry slowly without flooding the space with moisture. She moved Sable closer to the rear, positioning the mare so her body created a pocket of warm air between the wall and the 2 girls. She pulled the 1 dry blanket over Nell and pressed against her from the other side. Body heat, the oldest technology, the only one that was free. The wall leaked. The additional bodies had changed the air dynamics. More carbon dioxide, more moisture, more warmth near the rear, but more condensation on the cold outer stones. Water beaded on the inside face of the wall and dripped, and each drip carried heat from the air into the stone floor where it was wasted. Matea packed snow into the worst cracks, then stopped. Packed snow against the outer wall would melt from inside heat, refreeze from outside cold, and seal the gaps too tightly. She was making the same mistake Rosario had warned her about. She pulled the packed snow out by hand, her skin burning from the contact, and replaced it with dry juniper bark that insulated without sealing. She adjusted the high vent. She opened it slightly wider to clear the moisture that 3 breathing bodies were pumping into the space. The temperature dropped 2 degrees. She closed it halfway. The air grew heavier but warmer. She found a middle point, not by calculation, but by sitting still and breathing and waiting until the air felt like something she could sleep in without waking to a headache. The manure was a problem and a resource. Sable had deposited a pile near the entrance that steamed in the cold air. Matea moved it with the tin cup, the only tool she had, and packed it under a stone lip on the far side of the alcove, away from the sleeping area. Horse manure composting in a contained space generated heat, not much, but measurably more than bare stone. Rosario had told her this. A stable is warm partly because the animals eat, and partly because what they leave behind is still working. She fed Sable the last beet pulp mash mixed with warm seep water she had collected before the storm slowed the flow. The mare drank and ate with her usual patience. Matea watched the horses breathing, still deep, still even. The mare was gaunt and tired, and her coat was dull, but her eyes were clear, and her gut was moving. A horse with a moving gut was a horse generating heat. By midnight of the second storm day, the alcove had reached an equilibrium that Matea could not have predicted but could feel. The rear wall held at 46 degrees, the air near the sleeping area, warmed by 3 bodies and 1 horse, sat at 42. The entrance was below freezing, but the core, the pocket where they lived, held. Nell woke before dawn. She did not speak. She lay against the warm stone and stared at the ceiling and breathed air that smelled of horse and smoke stain and ancient stone, and she was alive, and she could not explain why. Across the valley, the storm did what storms do to the unprepared. At the orphanage, pipes froze in the walls. The kitchen stove stood cold. The coal that Prahl had failed to procure was now buried under drifts that blocked the road from Dolores. Children huddled in the laundry room, the only space with residual heat from the previous day's wash boilers. Prahl locked his office door and burned his desk chair in the fireplace. At the livery in Manco's, Cade found one of his mules dead in the exposed shed along the canyon road. The animal had been healthy the day before. It had died from wind exposure, not gradual cold, but the wind's relentless theft of body heat, from an animal standing in the open with nothing between it and the north. The same wind that pounded the alcove wall. The difference was the wall. On the storm's second day, Rosario tried to reach the canyon. She had promised to return with beet pulp. She had purchased it, packed it, and set out on foot from the orphanage road before the storm's second wave arrived. She reached the canyon mouth and started down the floor trail before the wind made standing impossible. She found the abandoned sheep shelter, a 3-sided stone pen with a partial brush roof, a quarter-mile short of the cliff base. She crawled inside and pressed against the downwind wall and wrapped her rebozo over her head and waited. Cade found her there on the morning of the third day, after the wind dropped to something a horse could stand in. She was alive, barely. Her fingers were white to the second knuckle. Her cough had deepened into something that rattled when she breathed. Her lips were the color of old paper. She told him 3 things before he put her in the wagon. South wall, heat in the stone, do not break her door. Cade stared at her. Whose door? Matea's. He left Rosario with the doctor's wife in Manco's and rode for the canyon. He brought 2 men, Porter, his stable hand, and a rancher named Goss who owned land near the canyon mouth and had reason to know whether an unstable cliff threatened his pasture. They reached the ledge trail by late morning. The snow was deep, but the wind had scoured the stone face enough that the footholds were visible. Cade climbed first. He was 62, and his knees made sounds like green wood splitting, but he climbed because he had told Matea Rourke that the canyon keeps what it takes, and he needed to know if he had been right or wrong. He expected bodies. He reached the alcove and saw the wall first, crusted with ice on the outside, wet with thaw on the inside. The upper course was battered inward, just as Rosario had taught. The juniper-packed gaps were tight. The army blanket hung over the entrance, frozen on the outer face, damp on the inner. He pulled the blanket aside and stepped through. The air hit him like a room, not a warm room, a room above freezing, with the particular weight of air that has been breathed and shared and held inside stone for days. The rear wall glistened with moisture from the melt-refreeze cycle. The thermometer on its juniper peg read 52 degrees. Sable stood against the back wall, gaunt. Her ribs showed like the slats of a fence. Her hip bones jutted. But she was standing, her weight on all four legs, her breathing even, her eyes tracking Cade's movement with the calm awareness of an animal that knew the difference between a threat and a visitor. Nell Custis lay on the stone floor wrapped in the army blanket, her color better than it had any right to be, her eyes open and fixed on the entrance with the wariness of someone who had recently been pulled from death and was not yet sure the rescue was real. And Matea Rourke sat between the mare and the wall, with a knife in her hand and a look on her face that Cade recognized. He had seen it on freighters who had driven loaded wagons through floods. He had seen it on mothers who had nursed children through diphtheria. It was not relief. It was not triumph. It was the flat, exhausted attention of a person who had not stopped guarding for 3 days and did not know yet that the danger was past. "You are alive," Cade said. "The wall held," Matea said. Cade looked at the thermometer. 52 degrees. After 3 sunless days. In a space with no stove, no coal, no fuel beyond one horse, and the heat stored in stone. He looked at the ancient smoke stains on the ceiling. He looked at the crumbled walls of rooms that had kept families alive centuries before Matea was born. He looked at the girl with the knife and the horse with the ribs and the wall that leaned inward because a laundress's daughter had taught a runaway orphan how to build against the wind. He did not say anything for a long time. Then he sat down on the stone floor with his back against the wall and his hat in his hands, and he felt the heat moving through the rock and into his coat, and through his coat and into his skin. And he understood that everything he had known about winter in this canyon was not wrong. It was incomplete. The storm had passed. The alcove held. The girl who had nothing had turned a cliff face into a shelter that outperformed every stove and cabin within 20 miles. But survival was not the end. Survival never is. Because now the community knew Matea Rourke was alive, and the horse was alive, and the story Gideon Prawl had told about a thief and a stolen animal and a deserved death in the wilderness was about to come apart, and Prawl knew it too. Cade brought Matea and Nell down from the alcove on the morning after the storm broke. The descent was slow. Nell's legs were weak, and her fingers were wrapped in cloth strips because the skin had split where the cold had reached deepest. Sable walked the ledge trail with the careful patience of an animal that had learned exactly which stones held weight and which ones crumbled, and she did not need Matea's hand on the halter to know the way. At the canyon mouth, Goss, the rancher who had climbed with Cade, stopped walking and turned to his companion. "That wall," Goss said. "A girl built that wall." "A girl and a laundress," Cade said, "with no mortar, no stove, no fuel, and the thermometer read 52. After 3 days of no sun." Goss looked back toward the cliff where the alcove was hidden behind the ledge's curve. He shook his head, not in disbelief, but in the particular bewilderment of a man who has spent his life solving a problem one way and has just been shown that the problem was not what he thought it was. Matea rode Sable into Mancos at midday. She did not ride through the center of town. She rode to the livery where Cade had a stall and clean hay and water that was not filtered through sandstone. She unsaddled the mare, picked all 4 hooves, rubbed the legs from knee to hoof the way Rosario had taught her, and gave Sable a full bucket of oats and beet pulp mash that Cade had prepared without being asked. Then she went to see Rosario. The laundress was in the doctor's wife's back room, propped on 2 pillows with a wool blanket over her chest. Her breathing was audible from the doorway, a wet, catching sound that made Matea's stomach tighten. Rosario's fingers were bandaged. The white had receded from the tips, but the skin was still waxy and loose, the tissue beneath damaged in ways that would not fully heal. Rosario saw Matea and said, "The wall held?" 52 degrees after 3 days. Rosario closed her eyes. When she opened them, they were bright. I told Cade not to break the door. He did not? Good. They sat together without speaking. The doctor's wife brought broth. Rosario drank half and pushed the rest toward Matea, who drank it because refusing would have been an argument she did not have the energy for. Prawl made his move before the snow had melted from the main road. He appeared at the deputy's office with his ledger and his receipt book and a formal complaint alleging theft of one draft mare valued at $90, theft of feed and tack valued at $12, and the corruption of a minor ward, Nell Custis, by inducing her to abscond from institutional care. The deputy, a man named Harshaw, who had spent the storm digging his own livestock out of drifts and was not in a generous mood, listened to Prawl's account and asked one question. "Where were the children in your care during the storm?" Prawl hesitated. "In the building." "Which room?" "The laundry." "Was the laundry heated?" "The boilers had residual warmth." "Residual warmth." Harshaw leaned back. "My understanding is that your coal delivery failed 6 days before the storm, and you made no alternative arrangements." "The roads were blocked." "The roads were open for 4 of those 6 days. My wife bought coal from Denton's yard on the 8th. You did not." Prawl shifted in his chair. The ledger sat on his knee like a shield he no longer trusted. "The complaint is filed," Harshaw said. "I will investigate when the roads clear fully. That includes the mare, the girl, and the conditions at your facility." "All of it." Prawl left the deputy's office with the complaint accepted, but the ground shifting beneath him. He had expected the law to see a thief. The law was looking at a headmaster who had no coal. In the livery yard that afternoon, Tolliver Cade did something he had never done in the presence of other men. He admitted he had been wrong. He did not do it grandly. He did it the way he did everything, standing by a fence rail speaking to Goss and 2 other ranchers who had come to hear what the canyon search had found. "I told that girl the canyon keeps what it takes," Cade said. "I meant it would kill her. I was wrong about what it keeps. It kept her because she listened better than I did." Goss asked what he meant. Cade described the alcove, the south-facing overhang, the ancient walls, the battered breast wall Matea and Rosario had built. The seep. The horse positioned at the rear for radiant warmth, the high vent and the low entrance, the thermometer reading 52 degrees, no fire, no coal, no stove. "I have heated barns with cordwood all my life," Cade said, "burned through 3 cords in a bad week and still lost animals to the cold. That girl used a wall and a horse and lost nothing." The ranchers listened. One of them, a man named Goss's brother-in-law, who ran sheep on the mesa above the canyon, asked the question that mattered. "Can it be copied?" Word moved through the valley the way word always moved in small communities, not through announcement, but through conversation. At the Mercantile, a ranch wife mentioned the alcove to another ranch wife, who mentioned it to her husband, who asked Goss about it at the feed store. At the livery, stable hands repeated what Cade had said. At the school, the teacher heard the story from 2 different children who had heard it from 2 different parents, and the versions did not match, which meant the story was real, because lies are consistent and truth arrives in fragments. Within a week of the storm's end, 3 ranching families had come to Cade's livery, asking to speak with the girl. Cade sent them to Matea, who was staying in the livery's tack room because she had no other shelter and because the alternative, Colkert, returning to the orphanage was not an option while Prawl remained headmaster. The first visitor was a sheep rancher named Aldous Meek, whose lambing shed faced north and lost 2 to 4 lambs every cold snap to exposure. He wanted to know how the girl kept a horse alive in a cave. Matea corrected him. It is not a cave. It is an alcove, open on one side. The opening faces south. My shed faces north. Then the sun never heats your back wall. I have a stove in the shed. How much wood does it burn? Meek calculated. 3/4 quart a week in hard cold. And you still lose lambs. The ones farthest from the stove. Matea did not lecture. She asked questions. Where did frost form first inside the shed? Where did the animals gather when left to choose? Where did morning sun first touch the building? Meek answered each question, and with each answer he began to see his own shed differently. The frost formed on the north wall. The animals gathered on the south side. The morning sun hit the east face but never reached the interior because the door was on the west. Your shed fights the weather, Matea said. Turn the opening. Face the long wall south. Darken it with soot wash. Stack stone against it inside. The sun heats the stone during the day. The stone heats the lambs at night. You still use your stove, but you burn less, and the heat has somewhere to go besides the ceiling. Meek stared at her the way Nell had stared at the warm wall, not with disbelief, with the specific confusion of a person who has just been shown that the answer was always there, in the orientation of a building, in the color of a wall, and the direction the sun travels in winter. He did not copy the method immediately. He went home and stood inside his lambing shed at 3 in the afternoon and put his hand on the south wall. It was cold. He walked outside and put his hand on the same wall's exterior. It was warm. The sun had been heating the outside of his shed for years, and the heat had never reached the inside because the wall was thin board with no mass to hold it. He replaced the interior face with stacked stone, field stone from his own pasture, mortared with creek mud and lime, and darkened the surface with a soot wash made from stove ash and water. He widened the south-facing window. He moved the stove to the north side so its heat pushed toward the center rather than rising uselessly against the already warm south wall. The next cold snap came in late January. Meek lost no lambs. His stove burned half the wood it had consumed before. The ewes stood against the south wall by choice, their wool steaming in the morning sun, their lambs tucked between their bodies in the warm stone. He told Goss. Goss told his brother-in-law. The brother-in-law told a widow named Etta Frey, who lived alone in a cabin with a root cellar that froze her stored potatoes every year. Etta lined the south wall of her cellar with dark stone and left a gap at the top for air. Her potatoes survived February. The method did not spread as a blueprint. It spread as a principle. Face the sun, hold the heat, stop the wind, vent the air. Each person who adopted it changed it for their situation. The lambing shed was not the alcove. The root cellar was not the lambing shed. But the physics was the same, and the physics did not care whether the person applying it was a 16-year-old orphan or a 60-year-old rancher. It cared about mass, orientation, and the difference between air that moved and air that was sealed. Prawl watched the method spread and understood what it meant. Every family that adopted the technique was a family that owed its improvement to Matea Rourke. Every rancher who darkened a wall or stacked stone against a shed was a person who would testify, if asked, that the girl Prawl called a thief had given them something worth more than a $90 horse. His response was predictable. He could not attack the method. He attacked the source. The girl squats in Indian ruins, Prawl said at the mercantile, loudly enough that 4 people heard. She is teaching people to build with mud and manure like savages. and the Mexican woman who helped her has been selling orphanage property to fund it. The mercantile owner, who had already heard from Meek about the lambing shed, said nothing. A ranch wife named Porter, no relation to Cade's stable hand, who had lost stored food every winter for a decade, said, "My cellar stayed above freezing for the first time in 9 years, Gideon. I do not care if she learned it from ruins or from God himself." Prawl left the mercantile, with the words hanging in the air behind him. He had expected the community to see contamination. They were seeing results. Rosario recovered slowly. Her lungs carried the storm in them now. A rattle that surfaced when she breathed deeply, a cough that came in the mornings and did not fully leave by afternoon. The doctor's wife said the cold had settled into tissue that would scar and stiffen. Rosario accepted this the way she accepted weather. She adjusted. She slowed her walking. She stopped carrying heavy loads. She did not stop teaching. In late January, Rosario and Matea returned to the alcove together. The trail was clear enough to climb, though Sable stayed at the livery. The mare was still regaining weight, and the climb was unnecessary while there was no storm. They went on foot, slowly, Rosario stopping twice to catch her breath on the switchbacks. The alcove looked different in pale winter sunlight. The wall Matea had built was partially collapsed where ice had expanded in the joints. The army blanket was a frozen rag on the ground. The seep was running freely, faster than during the storm, feeding a small pool in the clay depression where Matea had hollowed a basin. But the rear wall was warm. Rosario placed her hand on it and stood still for a long time. Matea watched her. The older woman's eyes moved across the ancient walls, the intact rooms at the back that neither of them had entered, the smoke stains that recorded centuries of fires lit by people whose names were carried in languages neither of them spoke. "We need to fix the outer wall," Rosario said, "but we do not touch the inner ones." "I know. I'm saying it because later, when people come, and they will come, they will want to see the old rooms. They will want to take things. You must mark a line." They spent the day repairing the breast wall. Rosario showed Matea how to set the foundation stones deeper, digging a trench in the alcove floor so the base course sat below grade and could not be pushed outward by frost heave. She showed her how to taper the wall thinner at the top, not for aesthetics, but because a lighter top course put less pressure on the joints below and could flex slightly in wind without cracking the mud mortar. They worked in the easy rhythm of people who have done physical labor together long enough to anticipate each other's movements. Rosario handed stones without being asked. Matea mixed mud to the right consistency without checking. She knew the feel now, the point where wet sand and clay became something that would hold. During a rest, sitting against the rear wall with their hands wrapped around cups of seep water warmed by the stone, Rosario told Matea about her father. "He built walls for 40 years, Rosario said. Adobe, stone, mud, and straw. He said a wall is a conversation between weight and air. Too much weight and the wall cracks. Too much air and the wall falls. The right wall is the one that breathes." Like the alcove. Like any living space, your body breathes. A wall must breathe. If you seal a house completely, the air inside dies. If you leave it open, the heat leaves. Every builder is finding the place between sealed and open. Rosario. "Yes. Thank you." Rosario looked at her. "For what?" "You climbed into a canyon in December for me. You almost died." "I climbed into a canyon because you had already done something worth climbing for. You saw the room before I did. I only taught you how to read the walls." They disagreed once during the repair. Rosario wanted to plaster the interior face of the breast wall with a smooth mud coat to reduce air infiltration. Matea argued that the rough stone face radiated heat better because the surface area was greater. A rough wall catches more sun, Matea said. Each bump and angle is a surface that absorbs. A smooth wall reflects some of it back. Rosario considered this. She had spent her life smoothing walls because smooth walls shed water and resisted erosion. Matteo was thinking about a different problem, not keeping water out, but keeping heat in. You may be right, Rosario said. Leave it rough, we will see. The thermometer the next clear day read 2 degrees higher on the rough wall than on the section Rosario had test plastered smooth. 2 degrees was not a decisive margin, but it was a margin, and in the arithmetic of winter survival, 2 degrees could be the difference between water that stayed liquid and water that froze. In early February, Rosario told Matea she was leaving. Her lungs would not heal in Colorado. The altitude pressed on tissue that was already scarred, and the dry cold aggravated the cough. She had relatives near Abiquiu, in the lower country, where the air was warmer and thicker, and the winters were shorter. She would go there and rest and see if the cough relented. They both knew it might not. The goodbye happened at the alcove on a bright afternoon when the rear wall was 64 degrees and the air smelled of clean stone and juniper. Rosario placed her palm on the warm surface the way she had placed it on the adobe wall she had shown Matea years ago in another life when the lesson was about plaster and not survival. Do not let anyone name this place after me, Rosario said. It had a name before us. I know. And do not let Prawl turn it into property. It does not belong to him. It does not belong to you. It belongs to the people who understood stone before any of us arrived. Matea nodded. She did not trust her voice. Rosario descended the ledge slowly, one hand on the wall, the other holding her rebozo against the wind. Matea watched from above. The woman who had taught her how stone held heat was moving like heat, leaving stone after sundown. Slowly, steadily, with the inevitable grace of something that had given what it had and was now returning to where it came from. Matea stood on the ledge for a long time after Rosario disappeared around the lower switchback. The alcove behind her was warm. The valley below was white. Somewhere between the two, on a trail cut by deer and followed by a girl and a horse, the knowledge had passed from one set of hands to another. She went inside and began repairing the section of wall that the morning frost had loosened. She worked alone. The sound of stone on stone echoed in the alcove the way it must have echoed centuries ago, when other hands had built other walls in the same sheltered air. The secondary crisis came in March, when the valley believed winter was done. A late freeze struck on the 12th, 3 weeks after the last significant snow. The temperature dropped from 40 degrees to 9 in a single night. Creek ice reformed, exposed pipes burst. A rancher's watering trough cracked and drained, leaving 40 head of cattle without water until morning. And a child named Willow Bell wandered after a dog. Willow was 7, daughter of a ranch hand on the Goss spread. She had followed a border collie that had slipped its rope, chasing the dog through the pasture gate and down the creek bank where the ice was thin and the water beneath was moving. She fell through to her waist. The dog pulled her out by the sleeve, an act of instinct, not training, but by the time the ranch hand found her, Willow was soaked from the chest down and shaking so hard she could not walk. The nearest doctor was in Mancos, 8 miles away, and the road was iced. The ranch hand carried Willow to the bunkhouse and sent a rider for help. The rider reached town an hour later, but the doctor was already out on another call, a broken leg at a mine above Rico. Prawl, who had heard about the child through the mercantile owner, arrived at the Goss ranch with a statement and a solution. The statement: the child should be taken to the orphanage, which had walls, a roof, and a laundry boiler that could be fired for warmth. The solution was offered publicly, in front of 3 ranch hands and Goss's wife, in a voice loud enough that refusing it would look like negligence. Matea was at the ranch already. She had come to show Goss's brother-in-law how to adjust the lambing shed's vent spacing for the late freeze. She heard Prowl's offer from outside the bunkhouse door. She stepped inside. "Do not move her," Matea said. Prowl turned. His face went flat. "This is not your concern. Moving a wet child 8 miles in a wagon on iced road will kill her faster than the cold. She needs warmth now, not in an hour. The orphanage has a boiler. The lambing shed has a south wall that has been holding heat all day. It is 200 yards from here." Goss's wife looked between them. She was not a woman who deferred easily. She had run the household through every storm of the past decade, while her husband was in the high pasture. She looked at Prowl, whose building had frozen its pipes during the whiteout. She looked at Matea, whose alcove had held 52 degrees without a stove. "Show me the shed," Goss's wife said to Matea. They carried Willow to the lambing shed, the same shed Meek had modified, which Goss had then copied on his own property. The south wall was stacked fieldstone darkened with soot wash. The stove was on the north side. The afternoon sun had been striking the south wall for 5 hours, and when Matea pressed her hand against the stone, it was warm enough to feel through her glove. Matea worked without Rosario. She worked from memory and from the habits that 3 months of alcove living had built into her hands. She stripped Willow's wet clothes and wrapped the child in a dry horse blanket. She positioned Willow against the south wall, where the stored heat could radiate into the girl's back. She heated seep water. They had no seep, so she used creek water warmed in a pot on the stove, and gave it to Willow in small sips, not fast, because a cold body cramped when flooded with warm liquid. She moved 2 ewes into the space near Willow, not touching the child, but close enough that their body heat filled the gap between the wall and the blanket. She hung Willow's wet clothes on a rail near the stove, not against the south wall. Rosario's lesson about moisture and stone applied without thinking. She opened the high vent because 3 animals and 2 people in a closed shed would foul the air within the hour. She checked the smoke. It pulled outward through the vent and inward through the low door gap. The shed was breathing. Goss's wife watched every step. She did not interrupt. She did not question. She was the kind of woman who recognized competence and did not waste its time with doubt. Prowl stood in the doorway. He had followed them to the shed, unwilling to be excluded from a scene that involved a child's welfare. He watched Matea position the stones and the animals and the blankets, and his expression moved through several stages: dismissal, irritation, recognition, and finally something that looked like fear. Because what Matea was doing worked visibly. Willow's shaking was slowing. The child's color was shifting from gray to pink at the edges. The shed was warm in a way that Prowl's orphanage, with its stove and its coal and its boiler, had not been warm during the storm. "She needs a doctor," Prowl said. "She needs warmth first," Matea said. "The doctor will say the same thing." "You are not a doctor." "No. I am the person who knows which wall is warm." The doctor arrived 3 hours later. He examined Willow and found no frostbite. The child's core temperature had stabilized. Her extremities were pink. Her breathing was clear. "Who managed the warming?" the doctor asked. "The Rourke girl," Goss's wife said, "with stones and sheep and an open vent." The doctor looked at the south wall, at the dark stone radiating heat in the lamplight, at the 2 ewes pressed calmly near the child. He did not say anything about the method. He said, "Keep her here tonight. Do not move her until morning. Warmth, dryness, and not moving her again. That is what saved this child. Matea sat against the wall after the doctor left. Willow was sleeping. The ewes had settled. The stove burned low on the north side, supplementing but not replacing the heat in the stone. She thought about Rosario, about the way the older woman's hands had read the wall like a page, about the lesson that had seemed small at the time. Stone remembers heat longer than people remember kindness. And how the lesson had become something that could save a child's life in a lambing shed in March. She did not know if Rosario's cough was better. She did not know if Rosario was alive. She knew that the knowledge was here, in her hands, in the wall, in the way the smoke told her where the air was moving. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who needs to hear it before the weather turns. Prawl's complaint against Matea had stalled through January and February while Deputy Harshaw investigated the orphanage's operations. The Whiteout had exposed problems that Prawl's ledger could not hide. 3 children had developed frostbite during the storm. One, a boy of 9, had lost the tip of his left smallest finger. The kitchen had been without heat for 4 days. Donations intended for coal had been recorded in Prawl's ledger as received, but the coal had not been purchased. The money had gone somewhere the ledger did not explain. Now Prawl filed a second complaint. He accused Matea of endangering Willowbell by using unproven methods instead of proper medical care. He accused her of practicing medicine without training, and he accused her of promoting the use of Indian ruins and superstitious building practices that threatened the moral welfare of the community's children. The second complaint reached Deputy Harshaw on the same day that Goss's wife delivered a written statement describing Willow's recovery. It reached him on the same day that Meek submitted a tally showing 0 lamb losses since modifying his shed. And it reached him on the same day that Etta Frey, the widow with the root cellar, walked into the deputy's office and said, "Gideon Prawl let children freeze while that girl kept a horse alive in a cliff. If you are looking for someone who endangers children, you are looking in the wrong direction." Harshaw filed the second complaint. He also expanded his investigation of the orphanage to include financial records for the previous 2 years. Prawl felt the ground shifting. He was a man accustomed to authority that came from position rather than competence, and positions could be defended with paper, ledgers, receipts, complaints, titles. But competence was harder to argue against, because competence produced results that people could touch. They could touch the warm wall of a lambing shed. They could touch the unfrozen potatoes in a root cellar. They could touch the pink skin of a child who should have died of exposure and did not. Paper could not touch anything. Paper could only claim. The valley was choosing between paper and stone, and the stone was winning. Matea did not know this yet. She knew that Prawl was filing complaints. She knew that Harshaw was investigating. She knew that the community was divided between people who had touched the warm wall and people who had only heard Prawl's version. But she also knew that every week another family visited the livery tack room where she slept and asked how to make their shed or cellar or barn hold heat the way the alcove held heat. And she knew that each time she answered, the number of people who had seen the results with their own hands grew, and the number who believed Prawl's version without evidence shrank. She taught Nell Custis to read vents with smoke thread. They sat together in the livery on a February evening while Nell held a burning twist of dried grass near the gap under the stable door and watched the smoke bend inward. "It pulls in here," Nell said. "Cold air from outside." "And where does it leave?" Nell moved the smoke to the high gap above the hay door. The thread bent outward. "There. So the stable breathes, cold in low, warm out high. If you sealed this gap—" Matea pointed to the floor-level crack. "The air inside would stop moving. The horses would breathe the same air all night. By morning, The stalls closest to the sealed wall would be the worst air in the building. Nell was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I thought you were hiding in a hole. You were building a stove big enough to stand in. It was the closest Nell had ever come to admitting she had been wrong. She did not say the words. She did not need to. The statement itself was a conversion, not from doubt to belief, but from a person who saw shelter as a box that kept weather out to a person who understood shelter as a system that managed heat, air, and mass. Matea looked at Nell and saw the first student who would carry the knowledge forward without being asked. But the hostile skeptic's arc was not finished. Prahl had one more move, and it would be the one that finally turned the weight of the community against him, or against Matea. The investigation was narrowing. The county inquiry was coming, and the question was no longer whether Matea's method worked. The question was whether a man with a ledger could outweigh a girl with a wall. The answer would not come from the canyon. It would come from a room in Manco's, with a table and witnesses, and the particular quiet that settles over a community when it is about to decide whose version of the truth it will carry forward. The county inquiry convened in March of 1889 in the back room of the Manco's courthouse, which was not a courthouse but a timber frame building that also served as the land office, the surveyor's station, and on Sundays, the Methodist meeting hall. A table had been set in the center. 4 chairs faced it. Deputy Harshaw sat at one end with a ledger of his own, not Prahl's, but the one he had assembled over 3 months of interviews, receipts, and statements. Prahl arrived in a pressed coat with his hair combed flat and his own ledger under his arm. He sat in the chair closest to the door, which Matya noticed and filed away. A man who sat near the exit was a man who had already considered leaving. Matea sat on the opposite side with Nell beside her. She wore the same wool shawl she had worn into the canyon, washed and mended, but still carrying a faint smell of smoke and horse that no amount of lye could fully remove. Her hands were in her lap. They were the hands of someone who had spent 3 months lifting stone, and they looked it, scarred across the palms, roughened at the knuckles, with a strength in the fingers that did not match her frame. Cade stood along the wall. Goss stood beside him. 4 ranch families occupied the remaining space. Goss's wife had brought Willow Bell, who sat on her mother's lap with the indifferent calm of a child who did not understand why adults were gathered in a room to talk about her. Harshaw opened by reading the complaints. Theft of 1 draft mare, valued at $90. Theft of feed and tack, valued at $12. Corruption of a minor ward. Endangerment of a child through unproven methods. Promotion of superstitious building practices. He set the papers down and looked at Prahl. Mr. Prahl, you state the mare was stolen on the night of December 11th. That is correct. And the mare's value was $90 based on an agreed sale to a freight contractor in Cortez. Also correct. Harshaw reached into his file and produced a document. This is a bill of sale dated December 9th, 2 days before the girl left. It bears your signature and the contractor's. The sale was already completed. The contractor had paid a deposit of $30. You had agreed to deliver the mare on December 12th. Prahl's jaw tightened. The sale was contingent on delivery. The deposit was non-refundable. According to the contractor's statement, you told him the mare would be available on the 12th regardless of the girl's employment status. You had already arranged to send Matea Rourke to the Kendrick Laundry. The girl's placement was a separate matter. The girl's placement was part of the same financial arrangement. You sold the horse to cover debts you had created by failing to purchase coal with donated funds. Harshaw tapped his own ledger. I have receipts from 3 donors who contributed a total of $41 between October and November for winter fuel. Your ledger records those donations. Your coal purchase records show $12 spent. Where is the remaining 29? Prohl did not answer immediately. He opened his ledger, turned pages, and closed it again. Operating expenses, he said. Which expenses? General maintenance, food, supplies. Your food costs are covered by a separate county allocation. Your supply costs are itemized on a different page, and they total $6 for the period in question. I will ask again, where's the $29? The room was silent. Prohl looked at his ledger the way a man looks at a tool that has broken in his hand. Nell stood up. She had not been asked to speak. She stood because she had been carrying something for 3 months, and the weight of it had become heavier than the fear. He planned to sell Sable before Matea left, Nell said. I heard him tell the contractor's man on December 8th. The man came to the orphanage and inspected the mare in the stable. Prohl told him she was sound and available, and that the girl who tended her would be relocated so there would be no fuss. You heard this yourself? Harshaw asked. I was in the kitchen. The window was open because the chimney was smoking again. They were standing in the yard. The contractor's man said the horse was worth more than 90 if she was as calm as Prohl claimed. Prohl said he would take 90 because he needed the money fast. Prohl turned to Nell. You are a child in my care. You have no standing to testify. I am 17, and I have not been in your care since I climbed a canyon in a blizzard to bring food to the girl you tried to sell. The room absorbed this. Goss's wife shifted Willow on her lap. Cade, along the wall, crossed his arms and said nothing, which was its own kind of statement. Harshaw called Cade next. Cade described the storm. He described the orphanage. No coal, children in the laundry, pipes frozen. He described finding Rosario in the sheep shelter, barely alive. He described climbing to the alcove and finding the thermometer at 52 degrees. In your experience as a freighter and liveryman, Harshaw said, is a building without fuel in a December whiteout suitable for housing children? It is not suitable for housing anything, Cade said. I lost a mule in an exposed shed that same storm. The mule had more space and more ventilation than those children had. Harshaw produced a final document, a written statement from Rosario Valdez sent from Abiquiu by post. Matea had not known it existed. Rosario had written it on her own, in the careful hand that leaned forward as if hurrying toward the truth. The statement described Prohl's disciplinary practices. It described a boy of 11 beaten with a leather strap for taking an extra biscuit. It described Matea taking the blame for stolen oats. It described bruises Rosario had treated on 3 children over the past year. Bruises on the shoulders and upper arms where a strap would land if swung by a man standing over a child. Harshaw read the relevant sections aloud. The room listened. Prohl made his final argument. He stood and addressed Harshaw directly, his voice controlled but tight at the edges. The girl trespassed on an ancient ruin, Prohl said. She disturbed cultural property. She encouraged others to use the site for personal gain. The ruins belong to the public trust, and her occupation of them constitutes. A man in the back of the room spoke. He had been sitting quietly throughout the inquiry, a dark-haired man in a worn wool coat, and Matea had not noticed him because he had arrived after she sat down and had not introduced himself. His name was Joseph Naranjo. He was Ute, employed by the county as an interpreter for land disputes, and he had been asked by Harshaw to attend because the inquiry involved a site that might fall under federal or tribal interest. Naranjo said quietly in English that was precise and unhurried, "It was never yours to abandon." The room went still. Prohl opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at Naranjo, then at Harshaw, then at his ledger, then at the door. Harshaw concluded the inquiry by recommending Prohl's removal from the San Miguel Children's Home, pending a full audit of the institution's finances. The theft complaint against Matea was dismissed on the grounds that the mare had been sold without the ward's consent and that Matea's departure constituted flight from an unsafe environment, not theft. The endangerment complaint regarding Willowbell was dismissed on the testimony of the attending physician. Prawl was not arrested. He was not publicly shamed. He was removed, quietly, officially, through paperwork and procedure. He packed his desk, his ledger, and his coat, and he left Mancos on the April stage. He went to Durango, where he sought a position at another institution, and was turned away when the reference letters from Harshaw arrived before he did. He was made small. That was worse than punishment. Punishment implies the person mattered enough to warrant force. Smallness implies they did not. In the weeks after the inquiry, Matea did something she had not planned. She began teaching. Not formally, not in a schoolhouse. She taught the way Rosario had taught her, by asking questions, by putting hands on walls, by watching where frost formed and where animals chose to stand. She taught at ranches, in stables, in root cellars. She taught ranch women who had never been consulted about building design. She taught stable boys who had never been told that the direction a door faced could determine whether an animal survived a cold snap. She taught older children from the orphanage, now under a new matron named Clara Hess, who had been a school teacher in Durango and who understood that children required food, warmth, and the absence of leather straps. She taught Nell first and most thoroughly. Nell had the practical skeptic's gift for identifying what could go wrong, and Matea turned that gift into a diagnostic tool. When they visited a barn or shed together, Matea read the heat and Nell read the failure points. Where would water collect? Where would snow drift against the wall and melt into the joints? Where would animals crowd and block the vent? Nell found the problems. Matea found the solutions. Together, they could assess a building in an hour and prescribe changes that would survive the winter. The teaching brought Emmett Vale. He arrived in Mancos in late April of 1889, a 23-year-old telegraph repairman who had been sent from the Denver office to maintain the line between Durango and Cortez. He was thin, weather-tanned, and carried a leather case of maps and survey notes that he updated compulsively, as if the landscape might shift while he was not looking. He heard about the alcove from a lineman who had heard it from a rancher who had heard it from Goss. The story had distorted in transmission. The version that reached Emmett involved a girl who had lived in a cave with a wild horse and survived on moss. But the core was intact. Someone had used a cliff dwelling as a winter shelter. Emmett, who mapped terrain for a living, and who understood the relationship between sun angle, elevation, and exposure, was interested in the physics before he was interested in the person. He came to the livery and asked Cade where to find the canyon. Cade sent him to Matea. Their first meeting was a negotiation disguised as a conversation. Emmett wanted to see the alcove. He wanted to map it. He wanted to record the dimensions, the orientation, the wall specifications, the temperature differentials. He spoke about the site the way a surveyor speaks about a landmark, with precision and without sentiment. Matea refused. "You want to put it on a map," she said. "I want to document the method." Documentation brings visitors. Visitors bring damage. Not if the map is careful. Every map is an invitation. I will not invite people to a place that was not mine to begin with. Emmett studied her. He was not accustomed to being refused by people he was trying to help. He was also not accustomed to meeting someone who understood the implications of cartography better than he did. "What if the map shows the spring but not the dwelling?" he said. "Mark it as a water source, protected spring, no ruin, no alcove, no trail marked." Matea considered this for 2 days. She asked Nell. She asked Cade. She would have asked Rosario, but Rosario was in Abiquiu and letters took weeks. She agreed with conditions. Emmett could visit the alcove once. He could take measurements. He could record the orientation and the temperature data. He could not sketch the ancient rooms. He could not take any object. And on his map, the site would appear only as protected spring south-facing cliff, with no trail notation and no indication that the ledge was climbable. Emmett agreed. He climbed the trail with Matea on a May morning when the canyon was bright with new cottonwood leaves and the air smelled of wet stone and juniper pollen. He saw the alcove and stopped walking. "This is not a cave," he said. "No. This is architecture." "Yes." He measured the opening, 22 feet. He measured the depth, 23 feet at the deepest point. He recorded the ceiling height, 11 feet at the front, tapering to 6 at the rear. He noted the orientation, south-southwest, with the sun entering from approximately 10 in the morning to 3 in the afternoon during December. He read the thermometer 67 degrees on the rear wall at noon. He placed his hand on the stone and held it there for a long time. "The people who built here understood solar geometry," Emmett said. "The overhang blocks the high summer sun but admits the low winter sun. It is not accidental. It is designed." "I know," Matea said. "Rosario told me." "Who is Rosario?" "The woman who taught me what the stone was saying." Their courtship happened through work, not through words. Emmett helped Matea document the lambing shed modifications in Meek's barn, measurements, orientation, temperature readings before and after. He mapped the sun angles for 6 different ranch buildings and showed Matea which walls received the most winter light. She showed him how to read smoke for air movement and how to judge a wall's thermal mass by touching it at dawn and again at dusk. They argued about mapping. They agreed about stone. He drew careful diagrams of the breast wall's construction, the batter angle, the mud joints, the juniper packing, and Matea checked every line against what she remembered Rosario teaching. Where his drawing showed a straight joint, she corrected it to a staggered one. Where his measurement showed a uniform thickness, she showed him where the wall was deliberately thicker at the base and thinner at the top. He learned from her the way Rosario had learned from her father, not through instruction, but through watching someone whose hands understood something their words could not fully carry. By the summer of 1889, Matea had moved out of the livery tack room and into a cabin Goss's wife offered at the edge of the ranch. It was small, 1 room, a plank floor, a stove that drew well. Matea darkened the south wall with soot wash on her first day. Nell moved in a week later because Nell had nowhere else to go, and because Matea was the closest thing to family either of them had found. The winter shelter school began that autumn, not as an institution, but as a habit. When the days shortened and the first hard frosts hit, ranch families brought their questions to Matea. She held the sessions in Goss's barn, using the modified south wall as her teaching tool. She asked each visitor the same questions she had been asking since the first rancher came to the livery. Where does frost form in your building? Where do your animals stand when left to choose? Where does the morning sun first touch your walls? The answers taught people to see their own buildings differently. A man who had stacked cord wood against his south wall for 10 years suddenly understood he was blocking the only surface that could heat itself for free. A woman who had sealed every crack in her root cellar understood she was trapping moisture that rotted her stores. A stable hand who had always wondered why horses crowded the back left corner of the barn realized they were standing where the afternoon sun warmed the stone foundation. Matea did not lecture. She demonstrated. She brought flat, dark stones to the sessions and placed them in the sun for an hour, then had each person touch them. She brought light-colored stones and placed them beside the dark ones. The difference was immediate and required no explanation. She held smoking grass twists near barn vents and let the smoke tell the story. She asked children to find the warmest spot in the barn without being told where it was. And the children found it every time because children paid attention to their bodies in ways adults had forgotten. By the second winter, 1890, the school drew families from as far as Cortez and Dolores. Matea taught in Goss's barn, and in Meek's lambing shed, and once in Etta Frey's root cellar, where 12 people stood in a space designed for potatoes and felt the south wall radiating heat at 4 in the afternoon. Sable attended every session. The mayor stood in the barn's south corner, the warm corner, always. And the children who came with their parents gravitated to her the way children gravitate to any large, calm animal that does not mind being touched. Sable was old for hard work now. She no longer hauled or climbed. She stood and breathed and radiated the warmth of 1,900 pounds of living mass, and the children pressed against her sides and felt what Matea had felt on the first night in the alcove, that a horse was not just an animal. A horse was a furnace that loved you back. Emmett and Matea married in the spring of 1891 in the Mancos courthouse, with Nell as witness and Cade standing in the back row, wearing a clean hat for the first time anyone could remember. The ceremony was brief. Emmett gave Matea a compass. Matea gave Emmett a stone from the alcove's outer wall, not from the ancient rooms, but from the breast wall she had built, a piece of sandstone the size of a fist that still carried the stain of smoke from the Whiteout. They built their life the way they built walls, together, through labor, with disagreements about angles and agreements about foundations. Emmett mapped seep locations and sun exposures across the valley. Matea trained women and stable hands in heat banking and draft control. They worked as a pair, complementary in the way that a person who reads terrain and a person who reads stone are complementary. Children came. 2 boys, born in 92 and 94. They grew up in a cabin with a darkened south wall and a mother who could tell the outdoor temperature by touching the interior stone. They learned to read smoke before they learned to read books. They thought everyone's house had a warm wall and a high vent, and a mother who pressed her palm against the stone each evening, the way other mothers checked the stove. The orphanage under Clara Hess became a different place. Children were placed with families under local oversight. The building's south wall was modified, Matea's first institutional project, done without payment because the building still held children, and children deserved warm walls regardless of who paid for them. The community changed in ways that were visible from the road. Barns had lower windbreaks on the north side. Root cellars had darkened south walls. Lambing sheds faced the winter sun when the terrain allowed. New buildings went up with attention to orientation. Not everyone, not always, but enough that a traveler passing through the Mancos Valley in 1895 would notice that the structures here sat differently on the land than structures in towns where the sun was treated as decoration rather than fuel. The hidden alcove remained hidden. Emmett's map showed a protected spring and nothing more. Matea returned once a year, usually in autumn, to check the breast wall and clear debris from the seep. She never took anyone except Nell, and later her sons. She never removed anything from the ancient rooms. She never added anything to them. The boundary Rosario had marked, fallen outer stone may be used, shaped ancient blocks may not, held as law in a place where no law had been written. Years compress the way years do when the crisis is past and the work continues. Emmett's hair went gray at the temples. Matea's hands, already scarred, grew stronger and then stiffer as the joints took on the particular ache of decades spent lifting stone. Nell married a rancher's son from Cortez and moved east of the valley, but she came back every autumn for the shelter school sessions, and she brought her own children who learned to read smoke the way their mother had learned. From a girl who had once climbed a cliff with a horse because every other direction was closed. Sable died first. On an April morning in 1897, 9 years after the night she had climbed the ledge trail in the dark, the mare lay down in the sun beside the cabin's south wall. She did not get up. Matea found her there at noon, still warm from the stone and from the sun, and from the 9 years of heat she had carried in a body that weighed nearly a ton and had never once refused to go where Matea asked. Matea buried her below the canyon trail, not at the alcove. The alcove belonged to older hands. The trail belonged to them, to the girl and the horse who had climbed it together when climbing was the only option left. She did not mark the grave with a stone. She marked it by knowing where it was. Matea lived out her later years near Mancos, teaching practical winter sheltering and helping former orphanage children find work that did not bind them to men like Prahl. She never claimed to have discovered the cliff dwelling. When people asked how she had learned the method, she said she was sheltered by it. When they asked who taught her, she said a laundress's daughter, who understood that a wall was a conversation between weight and air. Rosario Valdez died in Abacu in the winter of 1893. Matea received the letter in January and did not open it for 2 days because she already knew what it said. When she finally read it, sitting against the south wall of her cabin with the stone warm against her back, she found one line at the bottom in Rosario's leaning hand. It said, "The wall is still breathing." In the final autumn of her teaching years, Matea climbed the canyon trail one last time. She was 47, walking with a cane because a fall from a barn roof 5 years earlier had left her right knee unreliable. She climbed slowly, the way Rosario had climbed, one hand on the wall. The alcove was unchanged. The breast wall had settled into a soft line of stones, lower than she had built it, weathered by 15 winters into something that looked less like construction and more like the land reasserting itself. The ancient rooms at the back remained untouched, their walls carrying the same smoke stains, their floors holding the same dust. She placed her hand on the rear wall. It was warm. It was always warm. In the afternoon, when the winter sun entered low and struck the dark stone, and the stone remembered what the sun had said, 37 families across the Mancos Valley and beyond learned from Matea Rourke between 1889 and 1902. Not all adopted the full method. Some darkened a wall. Some reoriented a shed. Some simply learned to ask where the sun went in winter and let the answer change how they built. One detail spread farthest and lasted longest: the smoke test. Ranch children across the county learned to hold a smoking twist of grass near a gap and read the direction of the air, and they taught their own children, and the test outlived every wall Matea ever built. Matea Rourke died in 1909 in the cabin with the darkened south wall, in a bed positioned against the stone where the afternoon heat collected. Emmett was beside her. Her sons were in the next room. The stove was cold because it was April, and the wall was warm, and she had always trusted stone more than fire. Tolliver Cade had said it first on a sleet-driven night in an orphanage stable to a girl holding a halter rope and a sack of cornmeal. That canyon keeps what it takes. On that night, in December of 1888, every person who heard those words understood them to mean the canyon would take her life. By spring, the same words meant something else entirely. The canyon had kept her because she paid attention to what the stone already knew. It had kept Sable because Matea trusted the mare as more than property. It had kept the ancient dwelling because Rosario taught her that the walls were not hers to claim. Years later, after the last of Matea's students had passed the smoke test to their own children, and the lambing sheds faced south without anyone remembering why they had once faced north, snow crossed the canyon mouth again. The breast wall she had built was a low ridge of weathered stone, barely visible under juniper scrub. The ancient rooms behind it stood as they had stood for centuries, silent, dry, carrying smoke stains from fires no living person had lit. And in the late afternoon, when the December sun entered low through the gap between the canyon walls, it struck the rear stone the way it had always struck it, warming the dark surface by degrees, holding the heat there through the hours after sunset, giving the day back slowly to the cold air of the alcove. The way a wall gives back what it is given, the way stone remembers what the rest of the world has already forgotten.